It was a cold and stormy night when I was awakened by a strange noise coming from the old orphanage next door. My family and I were new neighbors in that place. Due to financial problems, my family had to find another place to live because the mortgage was too expensive and we couldn't afford it. We moved to a small house on the outskirts of the city. I didn't want to go, but as you know, a 7-year-old boy doesn't get to decide about his life. On the very first day, I heard something from my parents that disturbed me, and from then on, I never saw that place the same way again. My father, in a conversation with my mother in the dining room, asked her to avoid leaving me and my 3 siblings alone in those surroundings, because the place was known for its dark history and rumors of mysterious disappearances. My mother agreed and said she would do everything possible to prevent my siblings and me from being alone in those areas. I was very frightened by my father's recommendations. For a 7-year-old, this translated in my mind like a horror movie. I ran to my room, which I shared with my older brother Jeff, who was 12. Upon entering the room, I ran to the window that overlooked the back of the orphanage. A very old, quiet place with an unkempt garden, a medieval-type building that looked abandoned. Suddenly, I heard dishes falling from inside that place. I immediately closed the curtains and observed through a crack in the window where a damp, cold wind was sneaking through. Jeff sarcastically asked if I had completely lost my mind. I just looked at him and asked if that orphanage still took care of children. He said yes, and that I could go there and leave everyone in the family in peace. Don't be mad at Jeff. He's just like that, the typical older brother. But whenever I got into trouble, it was Jeff who got me out of it. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the orphanage. The day was so gray and cold, but my curiosity about that place was much greater. I kept walking around the area and saw that it was a very large and old orphanage. Everything was very quiet. The stone walls looked like a medieval castle. After almost an hour, the back gate opened, and one of the nuns emerged with several trash bags for the urban cleaning service to collect. Her eyes had deep, dark circles, contrasting with her snow-white, very pale skin. She was young, but had a somber aspect, a serious and sad expression. That's what I noticed. Could it be the imagination of a 7-year-old boy? Maybe. But that was the impression I got. After half an hour, I finished my round. Nothing more interesting happened until, when I was entering the gate of my house, I heard a whistle, as if someone was calling me. "Hey, come here!" It was the voice of a boy. I was sure I heard a boy's voice calling me. I looked around and saw no one. The street was empty, and the cold increased. I quickly went inside the house, very frightened. I entered the house, breathless. It was almost 6 in the evening, and dinner was being served. During dinner, I tried to talk to my parents to learn more about that orphanage. They knew very little and asked me not to bother the children there. I remained silent and continued eating. The next day, I continued my round of the place. It was very cold, with a fog that made the place look like Gotham City. Passing in front of the orphanage to see if there was any movement, once again, it seemed like there was no one there. But looking from a distance at the back of that gloomy place, I could see someone sitting on the grass. It seemed to be a child. I approached and saw it was a boy sitting on the grass. But what would a boy be doing sitting on the grass in such cold weather? I found it very strange. I got a little closer to see better, and it really was a boy sitting there within the orphanage grounds. I couldn't enter that orphanage. The boy had his head down, sitting, holding his knees. I thought it was strange. Was he being punished? I guessed. Slowly, he lifted his head and saw me from outside the orphanage. Since the place was surrounded by a gated fence, the view of those inside and outside was clear. The gates were large, and there was a huge, poorly maintained garden, and there sat the boy. Suddenly, I heard my name being called loudly. It was my mother, as always, annoyed with me. Normal. It was lunchtime, and I should have left there before she called me. She was waiting for me at the door of the house, irritated as usual. I entered without saying anything. She said I was grounded because I had been missing all morning. She looked for me and couldn't find me. I continued without saying anything, just sat at the table and started eating. At night, I continued to question my parents about that orphanage. At a certain moment, my father looked at my mother as if he knew something. Then he looked at me and asked me to forget about the orphanage. He said it was just a place where children without families live, nothing more. How could I forget? I lived next to them. I felt there was something wrong with that place, and being a very curious child, I would find out. The next day, I continued to circle the mysterious orphanage. To my surprise, the boy from the previous day was standing in front of the orphanage, seeming to be waiting for something or someone. He was a skinny boy, around 8 or 9 years old. I approached him, introduced myself, said I was new in the neighborhood and that we could be friends. The boy seemed like a robot, just staring at me without any reaction or saying a word. After asking his name several times, already feeling defeated because the boy didn't react, he finally looked at me and said his name was Marvin. After many attempts at conversation, we quickly became friends and started playing together every day. Marvin was different, with a sad look and an almost ethereal presence, but I liked his company. One night, while looking out my bedroom window, I saw something strange. In the windows of the orphanage, shadows of people moved and disappeared out of nowhere. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the shadows were there, writhing and forming human figures. The next day, I asked Marvin about the shadows. With a serious expression, he told me that the orphanage was haunted by the spirits of the children who had disappeared. He explained that many children ran away from that orphanage and were never seen again. I tried to laugh at the story, but the intensity in Marvin's eyes left me uneasy. One night, I was awakened by a whisper. I got up and looked out the window. There, in the windows of the orphanage, I saw something that chilled my blood. There were faces of children, pale and desperate, pressed against the glass as if they were begging for help. The empty eyes and open mouths in a silent scream made my heart race. I ran to my parents' room, but couldn't wake them, as if they were in too deep a sleep. Not knowing what to do, I hid under my bed out of fear and spent the night there. The next morning, the doorbell rang. The shock was so great that I almost ran to my room. I still hadn't recovered from the fright and the visions of the previous night. My mother looked at me irritated as usual and headed toward the door. I watched from a distance to see who was at the door. She was a nun. I deduced she was from the orphanage. She said a few words, smiled, and my mother smiled too. Then my mother closed the door while reading a sort of pamphlet the nun had given her. Curious to know what it was about, I approached her. My mother said that the next day we would take a tour of the orphanage. She said, smiling, "Now you don't need to keep wandering around the orphanage out of curiosity. Tomorrow, you, me, your father, and your siblings will visit the orphanage next door. Now wash your hands and go have your breakfast." I could hardly believe it. I was going to enter that place. The whole day, anxiety consumed me. I even thought about what to ask the nuns. The day arrived, and my mother, my siblings, my father, and I, as per the invitation, were welcomed by the Mother Superior. She led us through the premises. Then 2 more nuns joined us and began to guide us through all the floors and rooms of the orphanage. They told us the entire history, how it was built, how the place is maintained, its residents, everything I wanted to know. When we reached a display cabinet, she stopped and fell silent. Inside the old cabinet was a kind of filing system. She reached into one of her pockets, pulled out a bunch of keys, and with incredible skill, found the right key to unlock the cabinet and take out the file. She turned to us and said that the file had existed since the orphanage was founded and was the oldest record the place had. It was a record of all the children who had passed through there. The book was like an encyclopedia, and I was very curious because Mrs. Fernandez kept it as a relic. When she began flipping through the pages and showing my family and me all the photos and records of those who had been admitted there, something caught my attention. When she reached a certain page, I shouted that the boy in the photo was Marvin. Mrs. Fernandez, a very serious and strict nun, almost dropped the record when I said that one of the photos was of Marvin. She closed the book, and a tense atmosphere filled the room. My parents looked at me disapprovingly. In silence, Mrs. Fernandez lowered her head for a few seconds, then looked at me intently and, with a tone of compassion, said that the boy I had identified as Marvin was indeed named Marvin, as she confirmed before saying something disturbing. My child, yes, this is Marvin, but it is impossible for you to have known him. Marvin was the first boy to come to this orphanage. He was abandoned by his mother, who couldn't raise him. He kept trying to escape the orphanage to find out who his mother was, as he was left at the orphanage's door at the age of 2. During one of his escape attempts, Marvin fell from the highest window of the orphanage and died. My dear, stay away from any figure resembling this boy in the photo, for he passed away. You cannot be friends with him because Marvin died in 1899. My name is Elias, and I lived at the Blackwood Orphanage for 5 long years. When I arrived, I was only 7 years old. The building was imposing and terrifying, with its vine-covered walls and broken windows. At first, I thought the rumors about the place being haunted were just stories to scare the children, but I soon realized there was something very wrong there. The first few weeks were normal, if I can call them that. The nuns were strict but fair, and the other children were equally scared, trying to adapt to the new life. However, it didn't take long for strange things to start happening. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. I stayed still, with my heart racing, listening to the footsteps approaching my door and then moving away. I thought it might be one of the nuns, but the next morning, when I asked, they all denied being out of their rooms at that hour. A few days later, while I was playing in the yard, I heard someone call my name, Elias. The voice was soft and familiar, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I asked the other children, but they said they hadn't heard anything. The staff at the orphanage never stayed for long. The most they could endure was a year. They always left in a hurry, some even in the middle of the night, claiming they couldn't stand working there anymore. Only the nuns remained, as if they were somehow bound to the place. Over time, I began to hear stories from the other orphans about Mr. Blackwood, the founder of the orphanage. They said he was a cruel man who conducted experiments on the children living there. Some children claimed to have seen his shadowy figure in the hallways at night, always watching, always waiting. One night, I decided to investigate for myself. I waited until everyone was asleep and left my room. With a candle in hand, I walked through the dark corridors, following the sounds of footsteps and whispers that only I seemed to hear. The hallways seemed endless, leading me to parts of the orphanage I had never seen before. That's when I found a hidden door behind an old rug. I opened it carefully and descended a stone staircase leading to a damp, poorly lit basement. Down there, I found old books and rusty medical instruments. In the center of the basement was a metal chair with worn leather straps, as if it had been used to restrain someone. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly and saw a tall, shadowy figure with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It was Mr. Blackwood. He reached out his hand towards me, and the moment his cold fingers touched my arm, everything went black. I woke up in my room, drenched in sweat. I didn't know if what I had seen was a dream or a hallucination, but the scratches on my arm were real. I decided to tell the nuns everything, but they just made the sign of the cross and told me to pray. The next day, I was adopted by a family from the city. I never returned to the orphanage, but the memories of that place still haunt me. Some nights, I still hear the footsteps in the corridors and the voice whispering my name. Years later, I learned that the orphanage was closed and demolished. During the demolition, they found a secret basement with human remains. Mr. Blackwood was never found, but some people say he is still there, trapped within the walls of the orphanage, waiting for his next victim. My name is Sophia, and I lived at Willow Creek Orphanage from the age of 8 to 12. The orphanage was an imposing building, surrounded by an air of mystery and sadness. The townsfolk whispered about the place, but they never dared to speak openly. They said the orphanage had a dark history, full of terrible secrets. When I arrived, I was greeted by the nuns, who seemed to carry an invisible weight on their shoulders. They were kind, but there was a melancholy in their eyes that I couldn't quite understand. During the first few nights, I struggled to sleep, not because of discomfort, but because of the sounds I heard, heavy footsteps in the hallways, creaking doors, and sometimes whispers that seemed to come from within the walls. One night, I woke up with a strange feeling of being watched. I looked around the dormitory and saw a figure in the shadows. It was a woman dressed in a long white gown, her pale face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the broken window. I was paralyzed with fear, but when I blinked, she had vanished. I told the nuns about it the next day, but they simply told me to pray and not speak of it again. The caretakers at the orphanage never stayed for long. After a few months, they would grow pale and develop deep circles under their eyes, as if they couldn't sleep anymore. Everyone resigned before completing a year. Only the nuns remained, as if something kept them there. There was a rumor among the children about the lady in white. They said she was a former resident of the orphanage, a young woman who died tragically and whose spirit never found peace. Some said she sought revenge, while others believed she was searching for something or someone. I decided to investigate on my own. On a moonless night, I waited until everyone was asleep and quietly left my room. With a flashlight in hand, I walked through the corridors in silence. Footsteps echoed off the walls, and suddenly, a chill ran down my spine. I followed the sounds to a door I had never noticed before, hidden behind a wardrobe. I pushed the wardrobe aside and opened the door. Inside, I found a narrow staircase leading to a dusty attic. I climbed carefully, and there I found an old wooden box. Inside it were old photos, letters, and a diary. As I read the diary, I discovered that the lady in white was a young woman named Eleanor, who had been unfairly accused of a crime and locked in the attic until she died of starvation and thirst. Suddenly I heard a whisper behind me, "Sophia." I turned and saw Eleanor, her translucent and sorrowful figure. She pointed to one of the letters on the floor. I picked up the letter and read it. It was a confession from one of the nuns, admitting guilt for the crime Eleanor was accused of. I realized then that Eleanor wasn't seeking revenge, but justice. I took the letter to the Mother Superior, who turned pale as she read it. The next day, there was a ceremony in Eleanor's memory, and the letter was sent to the authorities. A few days later, I was adopted by a loving family. I never saw Eleanor again, but I'm certain she finally found the peace she sought. Years later, I heard that the orphanage was renovated and turned into a shelter for women in need. The nuns were gone, and the darkness that once haunted the place seemed to have vanished as well.